Welcome to my story. My name's Jake Gray. I'm 35, and this is a story I never imagined I'd be telling. For 6 years, I was happily married to Kelly, my beautiful wife, who looked just as stunning at 31 as she did when we first met. She had a youthful glow, a warmth that drew everyone in, and I felt like the luckiest man alive to be her husband. Despite our deep connection, our marriage had one challenge. I was eager to start a family, but Kelly wasn't ready. She'd reassure me with a hopeful soon, and I trusted her. After all, in my eyes, we had the rest of our lives together. Our relationship was filled with love and tenderness. It wasn't just the intimacy we shared, though that was incredible too. It was the quiet moments, the warmth of her hand in mine, her head resting on my shoulder. I treasured every bit of it. Holding her in my arms, I felt peace, a sense of belonging that I had never known. She was always responsive, always affectionate, and I believed she felt the same love and contentment I did. Looking back now, I can see where I might have been blind. I trusted her completely, without reservation. But that trust, that faith I had in her, would ultimately be the very thing that shattered me. The love I felt for Kelly twisted into a bitter anger, and finally into something hollow, like the ghost of an emotion that used to be real. People say that the opposite of love is indifference. But for me, my love for her transformed into a chilling rage, leaving nothing but a void. Now, you're probably wondering how a man who loved his wife so deeply could reach such a dark place. What happened that turned everything upside down? It all began with last year's Christmas party, an evening that started like any other but would change my life forever. As Christmas approached, I felt a growing excitement. I'd always loved the holidays, the decorations, the warmth, and the chance to spend time with family and friends. This year, though, things felt different. Kelly seemed distracted, distant in a way I hadn't noticed before. She'd been putting extra effort into her appearance lately, spending longer than usual in front of the mirror. She'd picked out a new dress for the party, one that hugged her curves and turned heads. I couldn't deny she looked incredible, but something about her excitement felt off. In the days leading up to the party, she'd talk endlessly about it, mostly about the people from her office, the plans, and the fun everyone would have. She'd casually mention her boss, Jim, more than once, her face lighting up as she described some joke he'd cracked or an impressive project he'd spearheaded. I'd feel a pang of jealousy, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was normal. Jim was her boss, and she respected him, that was all. But still, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was wrong. There was a lightness in her voice, a brightness when she mentioned his name that wasn't there when she talked about her other coworkers. It was subtle, like a hint of a smile she didn't realize she was giving. I wanted to ignore it, to chalk it up to my imagination, but the feeling lingered. The night before the party, I tried to bring it up, telling her I was looking forward to spending the evening with her. "I'll be at your side all night," I joked, trying to play it off as lighthearted. But she gave a small laugh, brushing me off with a quick "You don't need to babysit me, Jake. I can handle myself." Her response left me feeling strangely unsettled. In my heart, I felt a creeping sense of unease, but I told myself it was just nerves, just the usual holiday stress. I had no reason to believe anything was wrong. This was my wife, the woman I trusted more than anyone. The idea of her betraying that trust was unthinkable. But as I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the brink of something I didn't understand. And deep down, a part of me feared what the next evening might reveal. The night of the Christmas party arrived, and Kelly looked stunning in her new dress, a shimmering green that perfectly complemented her dark hair. She smiled as we left the house together, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her excitement wasn't for the reasons I'd hoped. I tried to brush it off, telling myself to relax and enjoy the night. After all, it was just a holiday party. When we arrived, the room was filled with familiar faces, colleagues laughing, drinks flowing. For a while, I managed to push my concerns aside, chatting with some of Kelly's coworkers, letting myself get lost in the holiday spirit. But when I looked over at her, my heart sank. She was standing close to Jim, her head tilted as she laughed at something he said, a little too easily, a little too openly. I approached them, trying to join in on the conversation, but Jim barely acknowledged me, his attention locked on Kelly. She greeted me warmly enough, but the moment felt forced, like I was an unwelcome interruption. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was reading too much into it, but the knot in my stomach only grew as the night went on. As the evening wore on, Kelly seemed to drift further away. Every time I looked around, she was with Jim, laughing, leaning in close, her hand occasionally brushing his arm. Watching them together sent a pang of jealousy through me, something I hadn't felt before. I'd never doubted Kelly's loyalty, never felt the need to worry about other men. But tonight, watching her with Jim, I felt a level of discomfort I couldn't ignore. Then came the dancing. I turned my back for only a few moments, talking to a coworker about a recent project, when I looked over and saw them on the dance floor. Jim's hand was on her waist, his face close to hers as they swayed together, laughing softly, lost in their own world. I couldn't help the anger that rose in my chest as I watched them, my fists clenching at my sides. The room seemed to blur around me as I watched the woman I loved move in ways I'd never seen with a man who wasn't her husband. I wanted to go over, to pull her aside, to remind her that I was her husband. But something held me back, a strange mixture of fear and shame, a voice telling me not to make a scene. Instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching her as the distance between us grew wider, realizing that this night was turning into something I'd never forget. As the night wore on, I tried to keep myself busy, focusing on conversations with others, but my mind kept drifting back to Kelly and Jim. The way they moved on the dance floor was almost mesmerizing, yet gut-wrenching. Every time I glanced their way, Kelly seemed completely absorbed in him, leaning in close, laughing at things that didn't seem all that funny. It was as though the rest of the world had disappeared for her, leaving only Jim in her line of sight. At one point, she glanced over her shoulder, catching my eye. For a moment, her smile faltered, as if she realized I'd been watching. But instead of coming over or making any gesture to reassure me, she simply looked back at Jim and continued dancing. I felt a wave of frustration and confusion. Had I been wrong to assume that she was fully committed to us, to what we'd built together? A part of me still wanted to believe it was all innocent, but the way she looked at him, the way she let herself be so freely charmed by him, it didn't feel innocent at all. At one point, I caught her walking back from the bar with Jim. She was laughing, a little too loudly, and he had his hand on her lower back, guiding her toward a quieter corner of the room. I approached her, hoping to reclaim some sense of normalcy, and greeted her with a forced smile. "Having a good time?" She smiled, brushing off my tension as though it were nothing. "Of course. It's the holidays, Jake. Let's have some fun." But as I watched her pull away, returning to Jim's side, I felt the gap between us grow wider than ever. My stomach twisted, the sense of unease hardening into something darker. I wanted to trust her, to believe that she was just letting loose, enjoying the party. But the way she moved around him, the way she laughed at his every word, it felt like she was crossing lines I never thought she'd blur, let alone break. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and casual conversations, none of which felt real. The laughter around me seemed hollow, the music grating, and every moment I couldn't see Kelly filled me with an anxiety I hadn't felt before. By the end of the night, I knew something was deeply, undeniably wrong. I'd come here with a sense of trust, of comfort in our relationship, and now that trust felt shattered. And as I watched her, lost in Jim's company, I realized that tonight was only the beginning of something that would change my life forever. I couldn't take it any longer. Watching Kelly with Jim all night, feeling like a third wheel in my own marriage, was eating me alive. At some point, I lost sight of her in the crowd, and a sense of dread settled over me. My mind raced with scenarios, each one worse than the last. I tried to tell myself it was irrational, that she'd never betray me. But something deep within me refused to believe it anymore. I needed to find her, to see for myself. I searched the main hall first, weaving through groups of laughing coworkers and friends, scanning every corner for any sign of her. She wasn't there. My heart began to race as I headed down a hallway lined with offices and storage rooms, hoping she'd simply stepped away to take a call or catch her breath. But the quiet, empty corridor only added to my unease. Then, down the hall, I saw a door slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out from inside, and hushed voices floated into the hallway. I walked closer, careful not to make a sound, my pulse pounding in my ears as I recognized her voice. I wanted to believe she was just talking, that maybe I'd find her with a group of people from work. But as I approached, her laughter, soft, intimate, cut through the air, paired with a familiar, low male voice. I peered through the crack in the door, my heart sinking as I took in the scene. There she was, standing far too close to Jim, her hand resting on his shoulder. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes meeting his with a softness I hadn't seen in a long time. I felt like the ground had fallen away beneath me, leaving only a sick, hollow ache in its place. My stomach churned as I watched them, unable to tear my eyes away from the betrayal unfolding right in front of me. The woman I trusted, the woman I'd loved with everything in me, was here in this quiet, hidden room, her attention wholly on someone else. At that moment, everything I thought I knew came crashing down. Every reassuring thought, every excuse I'd made for her, evaporated. The truth was right in front of me, impossible to deny. As I turned to leave, the weight of her betrayal crushed me, leaving me feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I don't remember how I made it back to the main hall, but once I did, everything felt surreal. My heart was pounding, my vision blurred by anger and betrayal. I knew I couldn't let this go, couldn't keep this hidden shame inside me. I had to confront them, to make them face the devastation they'd caused. Just then, Kelly reappeared in the hall, her face flushed, looking around as if nothing had happened. When she saw me, her smile faltered, and she approached cautiously. "Jake, are you all right?" Her casual tone only fueled my anger. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I saw you, Kelly," I said, my voice a low growl. "I saw you with him." Her face paled, her eyes widening as she quickly glanced around to see if anyone else had heard. "Jake, please, let's talk about this in private," she whispered, her voice laced with desperation. But I wasn't about to let her control the narrative. The pain and betrayal I felt demanded an audience. I spotted Jim nearby, still mingling as if he hadn't just destroyed my marriage, and I called out to him, my voice sharp and cutting. "Jim, why don't you join us?" He turned, his confident expression faltering as he saw the look on my face. He glanced from me to Kelly, quickly piecing together that the charade was over. He took a few steps toward us, his expression shifting to one of forced calm. "Jake, maybe we should step aside. This isn't the place." "This isn't the place?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You two didn't seem to mind sneaking around at your own company party, but now it's not the place?" A few people nearby turned to look, sensing the tension, but I didn't care. They were already whispering, watching as the scene unfolded. I wanted them to see. I wanted them to witness the betrayal, the lies that had shredded my life. Kelly reached out, her face a mixture of panic and shame. "Jake, please, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I repeated bitterly. "Then tell me, Kelly. What is it?" Because from where I'm standing, it looked pretty clear. Jim looked away, visibly uncomfortable, but I refused to let him off the hook. "You, too, Jim. What kind of man does this to a friend? To a coworker?" He opened his mouth, but no words came, his eyes darting to the floor. The weight of the betrayal hit me again, raw and unfiltered, as I looked at the two people who had gutted my trust. Their silence only confirmed what I already knew. The damage was irreparable, and nothing they could say would make it right. Without another word, I turned away, leaving them standing in the middle of their party, exposed. The truth was out now, and as I walked out of that hall, I felt a strange sense of relief, knowing I no longer had to carry the weight of their lies. After walking away from Kelly and Jim, I could feel a wave of emotions crashing over me: anger, betrayal, humiliation. But above all, there was a strange, steely determination forming inside me. They'd hidden their affair behind closed doors, whispered secrets in the dark, all while I remained blissfully unaware. That was about to change. I spotted a few friends nearby, colleagues who had been with me for years and had seen Kelly and me together countless times. One of them, Matt, noticed my expression and came over, concern etched on his face. "Jake, are you all right? What happened?" I clenched my fists, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Matt, Kelly's been having an affair. With Jim." I caught them in the back room. A ripple of shock crossed his face, quickly replaced by a look of outrage. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper but tinged with fury. Another friend overheard and joined us, and soon the whispers began to spread. People glanced over at Kelly and Jim, who were standing across the room, trying to act as if nothing was wrong. But the stares and hushed voices made it clear, the truth was spreading like wildfire. Fueled by my friend's support, I walked back toward Kelly and Jim, my voice raised enough for those around us to hear. "Kelly, Jim," I said, making sure their names carried across the room, "did you really think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I'd stay in the dark forever?" The crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward us. Kelly looked mortified, her face flushed as she glanced around, clearly aware that the whispers had turned into open stares. Jim tried to take control, his voice calm but strained. "Jake, let's handle this privately," he said, his tone an attempt to de-escalate. "Privately?" I repeated, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "You've had plenty of private moments, Jim. It's time everyone knows who you really are." By now, several of our friends and colleagues were watching, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Matt stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. "Jim, I can't believe you would do this. After all these years, to betray a friend like that." Jim's face turned pale as more people murmured, the betrayal evident to everyone present. Kelly seemed to shrink back, looking as if she wished she could disappear. But I didn't stop, fueled by the support of those around me, the collective anger directed at the two people who had turned my life upside down. The truth was out now, and there was no escaping it. I could feel a strange sense of justice in exposing them, knowing they would have to face the consequences of their actions in front of everyone who once respected them. As I walked out of the party that night, surrounded by the support of my friends, I knew I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, on my terms. After exposing them at the party, I realized there was one more person who deserved to know the truth, Jim's wife. She was as much a victim of their lies as I was, and I couldn't stand the thought of her being left in the dark. Before Kelly could even process what was happening, I grabbed my coat and motioned for her to come with me. "We're going to Jim's house," I told her, my voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Kelly's face went pale. "Jake, please, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. But I ignored her, my mind made up. She could deny and deflect all she wanted, but Jim's wife deserved to hear it from me, not from whispered gossip or vague explanations. The drive to Jim's house was filled with tense silence, Kelly sitting stiffly beside me, her eyes filled with panic. I could see the guilt and fear written all over her face, but it was too late for remorse. My thoughts raced, each one hardening my resolve. The hurt she had caused, the betrayal she'd allowed to fester, all of it led to this moment. When we arrived, Jim's wife, Sandra, answered the door with a warm smile that quickly faded when she saw Kelly standing beside me, looking visibly shaken. "Jake, Kelly, is everything okay?" she asked, sensing the tension. "No, Sandra," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry to bring this to you like this, but you deserve to know what's been going on." Sandra's brow furrowed in confusion, her gaze shifting between me and Kelly. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I spoke. "Your husband, Jim, he's been having an affair. With Kelly. I caught them tonight." The words hung in the air, heavy and bitter. Sandra's face drained of color as the reality of what I'd said sank in. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with disbelief and devastation. "Is this true?" she whispered, looking directly at Kelly. Kelly lowered her head, unable to meet Sandra's gaze, her silence confirming everything. Sandra's face crumpled, a mix of shock, betrayal, and pain washing over her. She backed away, tears filling her eyes as she struggled to process what she'd just heard. I felt a pang of sympathy for Sandra. She hadn't deserved this, hadn't asked to be thrown into this nightmare. But the truth, painful as it was, had to be faced. Kelly stood beside me, finally seeing the ripple effect of her betrayal, the impact of her choices hurting not just me but others as well. After a tense silence, Sandra looked up, her voice trembling but resolute. "You need to leave," she said, directing her words at Kelly. "Both of you. I need time to process this." Without another word, I turned to leave, Kelly trailing behind me, her face a mixture of shame and regret. As we drove away, I felt a strange sense of closure. The truth was out, and both Jim and Kelly would have to face the consequences with no way to hide. The drive to Kelly's sister's house was silent, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. I could feel Kelly stealing glances at me, her expression a mix of guilt and desperation, as if hoping I might soften, that I might somehow forgive her. But I knew there was no going back. After what I'd seen, after what she'd done, forgiveness felt as impossible as rewriting the past. As we pulled up to her sister's house, I finally broke the silence. "Kelly," I said, keeping my voice steady, "we need to talk about what happens next. About the divorce." She flinched at the word, her face paling, but I continued. "You'll stay here with your sister for now. I'll be getting in touch with a lawyer this week to start the process. I think that's best for everyone." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked at me pleadingly. "Jake, please, can't we talk about this? Work through it? I'm sorry for what I did, I really am. I never wanted to hurt you." I shook my head, my voice unwavering. "Kelly, you didn't just hurt me, you betrayed me. You lied, you made choices that shattered the trust we had. And it wasn't just one mistake. It was months, maybe longer, of deception. I can't live with that. I won't." She fell silent, her tears sliding down her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. I had loved her deeply, but that love had been built on a foundation of trust. And once that was gone, there was nothing left for me to hold on to. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "I'll handle the logistics with the house, the accounts, everything we need to separate. I want this to be as straightforward as possible. But I'm not going to drag this out. I want a clean break." She looked down, nodding slowly, as if finally accepting the reality of what she'd done. I opened the door, gesturing for her to get out. She hesitated, looking at me one last time. "I'm sorry, Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Without another word, I watched her walk to her sister's door, feeling a strange sense of relief as she disappeared inside. This chapter of my life was ending, but for the first time since that night, I felt a glimmer of hope. I was free to move forward, to rebuild, to live a life grounded in honesty. And as I drove away, I knew I'd made the right decision, one that would allow me to truly heal and start again. The days after dropping Kelly off at her sister's house were a mix of emotions. There were moments of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. I'd been forced to confront a reality I'd never imagined, and the future I'd once pictured was now gone. But as the dust settled, I found a strange, unexpected peace growing within me, a clarity that came from finally choosing to put myself first. The divorce process began smoothly, with both of us agreeing to handle it as simply as possible. Kelly made no objections, her remorse evident in her quiet compliance with the terms I set. I'd expected the process to be painful, and in some ways, it was. But each step forward felt like a weight lifting, a small victory in reclaiming my life. I focused on rediscovering who I was outside of the marriage, reconnecting with friends and family who'd always been there, waiting patiently to support me. I found myself smiling more, laughing at things I'd once taken for granted. Slowly, I built new routines, weekend hikes, cooking new recipes, exploring interests I hadn't had time for in years. The hardest part was learning to trust again, to believe that not everyone would break the promises they made. I took it one day at a time, forgiving myself for the moments of doubt, the days when bitterness crept in. Healing was a journey, one that I learned couldn't be rushed. Months passed, and as the divorce finalized, I felt a renewed sense of freedom. The life I thought I'd lost had simply changed form, transforming into something that was entirely mine. I'd come through the storm bruised but stronger, with a clearer understanding of what I wanted and needed from those around me. One evening, I found myself sitting in my newly rearranged living room, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sunset. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. The betrayal had marked me, but it hadn't broken me. I had survived, grown, and found a way to move forward. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that this new beginning was one I'd built for myself, a life shaped by resilience, by a commitment to honesty, and by the quiet strength I'd discovered along the way.